Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It is great to be here.
So today, we're doing something, something a little bit different. Usually on this show, we take a modern phenomenon, right? Like algorithmic trading or geopolitical shifts, and we trace the roots backward. But today, we are starting in the past. We're looking at a collection of essays published back in 1993.
Yeah, which is, it's a completely different world.
A completely different world. The Berlin Wall had just come down. The internet was barely a rumor for most people. The Soviet Union was dissolving. And yet, the source material we are covering today feels eerily prophetic. It really reads like a blueprint for the confusion we are living through right now.
It really does. It's striking how relevant it is.
We are diving into a book called For the Sake of Argument: Essays and Minority Reports. And it's by Christopher Hitchens. Now, I want to be really clear right off the bat because, Hitchens is a polarizing figure. He became very famous later in life for his views on religion, his stance on the Iraq War. But we are not talking about that guy today.
No, absolutely not. We are looking at Hitchens, the Washington correspondent.
Oh.
Hitchens, the observer of the Reagan, Bush, and Thatcher eras.
Exactly. And just as a quick disclaimer for you listening at home, this is not a book review. We are not doing a biography. And most importantly, we are looking at highly charged political events from both the left and the right here. But we are absolutely not taking any sides. We aren't endorsing the politics of the author or the political figures mentioned. We are just impartially reporting on the content provided in this text, trying to convey the ideas exactly as they were laid out in the original source material.
Right. We're treating this book as an entry point into a broader system.
Yes, a system map. We're looking for the plumbing, basically. Hitchens spent that whole decade obsessively documenting a very specific machine. And that machine is the interaction between political power, the journalistic institutions that cover it, the national security structures that hide things, and the cultural production around all of it.
Right. It is a consensus system. That's the core thesis we are exploring in this deep dive. We are looking at a machine designed to stabilize state power. And it does this by managing language, controlling dissent through forced bipartisanship, and maintaining this shadow history through intelligence agencies. How do you take a messy, contradictory reality and flatten it into a smooth narrative that everyone just accepts?
And what happens to the truth when you do that? So this is our mission today. We're going to pull out the design of this system, the incentives that keep everybody running it, the outcomes it produces, why it persists over time, and finally, how interconnection specifically through literature helps us see through the fog.
Which is a fascinating turn he takes at the end.
It really is. So let us start with the foundation, the design. If you want to build an architecture of consensus, where do you start? Hitchens argues you don't start with the police, you start with the dictionary.
You start with language. Exactly.
He has this concept of political correctness.
Yeah.
But wait, before you roll your eyes at that phrase, he is not talking about what we think of as modern culture war campus politics.
Right. Today, that phrase means something entirely different. But Hitchens was applying the term to the establishment itself, the politically correct establishment.
He calls them routine fatuities.
Which is such a great phrase. A fatuity is just something foolish or vacuous, but calling it routine implies that it is systemic. It is the everyday, normalized language of power. He lists these words that we hear constantly on the news, words like healing, bipartisan, divisive, put this behind us, the intelligence community.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though, because what is actually wrong with a word like healing? I mean, if a country has been through a massive trauma, say a huge scandal or a riot, isn't it the job of the state to heal the nation? Why attack that?
And that is exactly the pushback he anticipates. But he argues that healing, when used in a political context, is a complete fraud. It is a biological metaphor that has been grafted onto politics. Think about it. If you break your leg, you absolutely need healing. But if you have a fundamental structural political disagreement about wealth distribution or a war or civil rights, you do not need healing. You need argument.
You need conflict.
Precisely. So healing is used as a way to shut up the opposition. It acts as a sedative. It implies that the political disagreement itself is a sickness. If you are still arguing, well, you're preventing the healing. You're the disease. So the design function of that word is to pathologize dissent. It lowers the temperature of the room to a point where real structural debate becomes impossible.
Oh, that makes so much sense. It reminds me of how the word divisive is used. You hear this all the time. Oh, that candidate is too divisive. That policy is divisive.
Right, but democracy is inherently divisive. That is the entire point of it. If we all agreed on everything naturally, we wouldn't need a voting system. By labeling an idea divisive, the establishment is actually just saying this threatens the mini consensus we've built. It is a policing mechanism, but it is disguised as a concern for public manners.
There is a very specific example in the source material that really nails this concept of the mini consensus for me. It is from the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court. Now, again, regardless of anyone's politics regarding Clarence Thomas, this specific moment is fascinating linguistically.
Oh, yes, the philosophical moment.
Yes. So he was asked during the hearings about the death penalty. Now, this is a matter of life and death, state power, the Eighth Amendment. It is incredibly heavy stuff. And Thomas replied to the Senate committee that, philosophically, he had no problem with it.
And the room just nodded and moved on.
Right. But Hitchens stops the tape right there.
Yeah.
He asks, what does the word philosophically actually mean in that sentence?
It is being used as a hollowifier. In that specific room, philosophically does not mean according to a rigorous study of Kant or Mill. It doesn't mean I have a deeply considered moral framework for the state execution of citizens.
Just means I don't mind.
Exactly. It means it doesn't bother me. But if a Supreme Court nominee sat there and said, I don't mind executing people, he would sound like a sociopath. So the system provides him with a euphemism. Philosophically, I have no objection. It adds this layer of completely false intellectual weight to what is, essentially, a shrug.
And the senators just accept it because it sounds like the club language.
Yes, it's what the French call langue de bois, wooden tongue. It is a room temperature idiom designed to make sure that nothing raw, nothing real, ever enters the official record. The primary design feature of the consensus system is to ensure that matters of true principle are made unsayable. You can't have a raw argument about the morality of the state killing its citizens on national television. You have to have a polite, bureaucratic discussion about philosophical objections.
Wow. So the first pillar of this system's design is this sedated language. It keeps the public calm and the insiders safe. But obviously, you also need to control the information that actually gets to the public. You have to manage the media. And this leads us to the professionalization of the lobby.
The media management machinery.
Hitchens spends a lot of time on this, particularly looking at the UK under Margaret Thatcher, though he makes it very clear this applies equally to the US press corps. He talks about a figure named Bernard Ingham.
Right, Bernard Ingham was Thatcher's press secretary. But Hitchens argues that even the title of press secretary is a euphemism here. Ingham essentially created a centralized Department of State for narrative control.
How did he actually do that, practically speaking?
By professionalizing and monopolizing the leak. Now, normally we think of a leak as a breakdown in the system, right? A brave whistleblower steals a document and gives it to a journalist because the government desperately does not want it out.
Like the Pentagon Papers. Something adversarial.
Exactly. A genuine leak is adversarial. But Ingham perfected the authorized leak. He turned leaking into a monopoly of the Prime Minister's office. He would gather what's called the lobby, which is the highly credentialed, select group of political reporters allowed access to the government, and he would essentially tell them what to write. But the strict condition was that they could not attribute the quotes to him.
So they would have to write, sources say, or senior government officials believe.
Precisely. And this creates a deeply compromised closed loop. It is client journalism. The reporters desperately need the access to keep their prestigious jobs and get their front-page bylines. And Ingham needs their anonymity to manipulate the public narrative without taking responsibility.
There is this brutal, brilliant story in the book about John Biffen that illustrates this perfectly. He was a member of Thatcher's own cabinet, wasn't he?
He was the leader of the House of Commons, a very senior figure, but he made a tiny mistake. He hinted in a television interview that Thatcher might be becoming a bit remote, a bit imperious. He signaled just a fraction of an inch of independence.
Which is a fatal error in a strict consensus system.
Immediate punishment was required. But notice exactly how he was punished. Thatcher didn't fire him publicly. She didn't have a debate with him. Bernard Ingham summoned the lobby. He told the reporters, strictly off the record, that John Biffen was a semi-detached member of the government.
Semi-detached.
Which is a British real estate term for a duplex house, right?
Right.
But here, the euphemism meant he was politically isolated, barely hanging on. Now, the next morning, Hitchens notes that he opened all the major newspapers, the Times, the Guardian, the Financial Times, papers with entirely different owners, different editors, supposedly different political slants, and yet every single one of them described John Biffen as a semi-detached member of the government.
That is just incredibly creepy.
It's totally Orwellian. It proves that what looks like a diverse adversarial media landscape is actually just a repeater station for a single centralized transmitter. If every major newspaper uses the exact same highly specific adjective on the same day, you are not reading independent journalism, you are reading dictation.
And the average reader doesn't know that. The reader is sitting at home over breakfast thinking, wow, everyone from the left-wing paper to the right-wing paper agrees that Biffen is semi-detached. It must be an objective truth.
That is the consensus in action. It's not an agreement reached by independent investigation and debate. It is a synchronized script. The journalists have essentially become clients of the state. They trade their adversarial clarity for access to those semi-detached quotes.
So we have sedated language and we have a client press.
Yeah.
But there is a third pillar to the architecture of this system, and it is definitely the darkest one. It is the structural opacity of the state itself, the state within the state.
This is where Hitchens shifts from media critique into full constitutional crisis territory.
Yeah.
He argues that the intelligence apparatus, specifically agencies like the CIA in the US or the Privy Council in the UK, which he says should just be renamed the Secret Council, are not just anomalies. They are a deliberate design feature intended to create two completely separate histories.
The two histories.
Yes. There's the exoteric history. That's the one for the outsiders, for the public. This is the history of elections, bills being signed, grand public speeches, the front parlor stuff. Hitchens calls this the Stephen Foster melodies.
And the other history.
The esoteric history. The inner circle. This is the structural reality of how power actually operates out back. The Wagnerian drama. The history of coups, black budgets, covert arms deals, and intelligence operations. And the system is legally and structurally designed to keep these two worlds permanently separated.
He brings up a very specific constitutional point about the CIA here that I honestly had never realized before. It's about the statement and account clause.
Right. The U.S. Constitution is actually incredibly specific about how public money works.
Yeah, I looked it up while reading Article 1, Section 9. It says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time.
It is entirely unambiguous. If the government spends the taxpayers' money, it has to show the public the receipt. That is foundational to the concept of a republic. If you do not know where the money is going, you cannot functionally govern the government.
But the CIA doesn't do that.
No, they don't. Through the Central Intelligence Agency Act of 1949, they were granted a permanent exemption from that constitutional requirement. They operate a black budget. They can spend billions of dollars without any public accounting whatsoever.
But couldn't the expert or the defender of the system just say, look, we live in a dangerous world. We need spies. We can't publish a public receipt that says item 1, $1 million bribe for a general in a foreign country. That would completely compromise the strategic mission. It's a strategic necessity.
Of course. That is the standard realpolitik national security argument. But Hitchens is asking us to look at the systemic cost of accepting that argument. Once you allow a black budget to exist permanently, you have essentially created a post-constitutional government. You have created an executive branch that has the structural means to act, to start wars, to topple foreign governments without the consent or even the basic knowledge of the governed.
It completely severs the feedback loop.
It severs the most basic link of democratic legitimacy. You cannot be a functioning citizen if you are structurally blinded to what your own government is doing in your name. You just become a subject. And Hitchens argues, this is not an accident. It wasn't a temporary measure for the Cold War that got out of hand. It is the permanent, intentional design of the modern state.
So that is the architecture of the consensus. We have a language designed to prevent precise thought. We have a credentialed media that acts as a repeater station, and we have an intelligence apparatus that operates completely in the dark.
Right.
But a machine doesn't just run itself. It needs people to operate it. It needs incentives. Why do smart, educated journalists play along with client journalism? Why do political actors benefit from ambiguity? And why do citizens just accept the lie?
This is where we have to look at the incentive architecture. And the very first incentive is deeply psychological. It is the desire to belong to the club. Hitchens explores this brilliant concept he calls the we fallacy.
This is one of those concepts that once you see it, you literally cannot unsee it. You open any op-ed page today, and it is everywhere.
Our interests, our influence, our nuclear weapons, our position in the Middle East.
Hitchens quotes an essay by Lionel Trilling, And he specifically focuses on a liberal columnist named Anthony Lewis. Now, Lewis was actually a prominent critic of the Reagan administration. He wrote a piece aggressively opposing the U.S. interference in Nicaragua, and his big concluding thought was, "We have no business in Nicaragua."
And Hitchens just pounces on that sentence. He stops the reader and asks, who exactly is we?
It sounds like such a harmless figure of speech. We just means the United States, right?
But does it? Did you have business in Nicaragua? Did a steelworker in Ohio decide to covertly mine the harbors of Managua? No. The CIA did that. The executive branch did that. By using the word we, the journalist, even while criticizing the policy, is psychologically accepting the premise that the state apparatus and the citizen are the exact same entity.
It is a psychological annexation of the citizen by the state.
That is exactly what it is. It's a contract of allegiance. If I say we dropped the bomb, I am subconsciously taking moral responsibility for an action I had zero control over. I am aligning my identity with the generals.
But if I write the United States government dropped the bomb, it sounds detached. To a lot of readers, it might even sound unpatriotic or radical.
And that is the incentive trap. The incentive structure heavily rewards you for sounding like an insider. If you say the government is acting criminally, you sound like a dangerous outsider. You sound adversarial. But if you say we're making a terrible mistake, you sound like a responsible critic. You're still part of the establishment club.
So the professional incentive for the journalist, or the pundit, is to maintain their status as a serious person by adopting the pronoun of the state.
Precisely. You are fully allowed to criticize the tactics of the system, but you must accept the underlying identity and legitimacy of the system. You must accept the premise that we are the natural owners of the hemisphere. The moment you step outside the we, you are cast out of the serious debate.
Now, speaking of how the media manufactures this idea of a collective we have to talk about polling. I knew Hitchens was a bit of a contrarian, but I did not realize how much he absolutely despised opinion polls.
He loathed them. He saw the polling industry as a primary engine of the consensus system. And since we are doing a deep dive here, we really need to unpack the actual mechanics of this, because his argument isn't just the cliche that polls are sometimes wrong. His argument is that polls physically create the opinion they claim to be measuring.
He talks about the concept of fluidity and this idea of the forced choice.
Right. Imagine a pollster calls your house in 1990. They ask, do you approve or disapprove of the president's handling of the situation in Panama? Now, maybe you happen to work in two jobs. Maybe you couldn't find Panama on a map. Maybe you just genuinely do not care.
The honest structural reality of your opinion is, I don't know.
And in a truly rigorous scientific study of public sentiment, I don't know would be an incredibly vital data point. In fact, if 40% of the country says, I don't know about Panama, that is a massive story. It means the public is completely disengaged from foreign policy. But for a client-directed pollster, I don't know is a commercial failure. You cannot sell a newspaper headline that says, America shrugs.
So they force the choice.
They lean on you. They say, well, if you had to choose, do you lean more towards agree or disagree? They take that massive fluidity, that 40% block of ignorance and apathy, and they relentlessly squeeze it until it looks like a hard opinion. They manufacture a binary split, 52% approve, 48% disapprove.
And suddenly, the next morning, the national newspaper headline reads, Nation deeply divided on Panama policy.
But the nation isn't deeply divided. The nation is largely thinking about what to have for lunch. The division is a total artifact. It is a hallucination created by the polling methodology itself. But, and this is where the feedback loop engages, once it is published, it becomes a social fact. Politicians read the headline and react to it. Pundits analyze the division. Reality is completely replaced by the simulation of reality.
There is an amazing historical example in the source material about Jimmy Carter in the 1976 primary. This is the bandwagon effect.
Oh, this is the ultimate feedback loop. So in early 1976, Jimmy Carter was practically unknown nationally. He was polling at something like 1%. But he did slightly better than expected in a couple of very small early caucuses, Iowa and New Hampshire. The media, desperate for a narrative, decided he was the story.
So they flooded him with coverage.
Tons of coverage. And because he was suddenly on the evening news every night, his basic name recognition went up. So the following week, the pollsters called people, and more people recognized his name, so he polled higher. And because the poll showed him surging, the media establishment said, look, he has momentum.
Which justified giving him even more coverage.
Exactly. It is a completely self-fulfilling prophecy. Hitchens argues that Carter didn't rise from 1% to the frontrunner because of a massive organic grassroots movement of the citizenry. He rose because the polling media complex needed a winner to narrate. The poll didn't measure the wave. The poll generated the wave.
And this entirely changes the incentive structure for how reporters do their jobs. Hitchens has this great, almost nostalgic image of the Macintosh reporter versus the green PC screen.
It's a real lament for the death of adversarial reporting.
Right.
In the old days, at least in the romanticized view, the reporter wore a raincoat, a Macintosh, and physically went out into the street. They talked to factory workers, to bartenders, to people on the bus. They got a tactile, messy sense of what actual human beings were feeling.
Which takes time, and it's unpredictable.
Highly unpredictable. But by the late 20th century, the credentialed reporter just sits in a climate-controlled office in Washington. They look at the green glow of a computer screen, they read the poll numbers, which, as we just established, are forced-choice fabrications, and they write a sweeping story about public perception.
They write, "The American people feel X today."
And they don't have to speak to a single American person to write that sentence. They just need the client-directed data. It is cheaper for the media owners, it is cleaner, and it is much, much safer for the journalist. You never get mud on your boots, and you never uncover a truth that contradicts the consensus. The media institutions internalize these norms.
So the incentive for the media is to stay inside, look at the screen, and quote the data. It's safe. But there is an even stronger incentive when we pivot back to the world of political actors and intelligence agencies. And that is the incentive for absolute willful ignorance.
All right, plausible deniability.
This connects directly to the Iran-Contra affair. And Hitchens focuses very heavily on the testimony of Robert Gates. Now, Robert Gates is an absolute legend in Washington. He was director of the CIA. He was Secretary of Defense under both Bush and Obama. He is viewed as the ultimate bipartisan wise man.
But Hitchens drags us back to his specific testimony during the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, as a quick reminder, this is a massive systemic crisis where the U.S. government covertly and illegally sold arms to Iran and then took that money and illegally funneled it to right-wing death squads, the Contras in Nicaragua. It violated congressional law on multiple levels.
And Robert Gates was a top official at Langley at the time.
He was the deputy director for intelligence. His literal job description, the reason his position existed, was to know things. That is what the I in CIA stands for. But when he was put under oath and asked about the illegal diversion of funds, he testified that he, quote, didn't want to know any more about it.
He actually said that out loud in a hearing.
He admitted to purposefully avoiding knowledge. He said he heard rumors of the illegal funding, and he actively decided not to ask any follow-up questions.
I mean, in literally any other profession, if you told your boss, I saw money going missing, and I actively decided not to check if it was being stolen, you would be fired for gross incompetence on the spot.
But in the architecture of the consensus system, that specific type of incompetence is actually a vital survival skill. Hitchens calls it the metaphysical power to negate knowledge.
The metaphysical power to negate knowledge. Let's really unpack that. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that within this specific bureaucratic structure, factual knowledge is a lethal liability. If you, as an official, officially know about the illegal arms deal, you are legally exposed. You might be subpoenaed. You might face prison time. You might bring down the administration. But if you carefully curate your own ignorance, if you deploy that metaphysical power to look away, you remain safe.
So the incentive structure actively rewards the person who refuses to look.
Exactly. The system naturally filters for people who are exceptionally good at not asking the next logical question. It promotes the willfully blind to the top positions because they are the only ones who can effectively protect the executive. If the president doesn't know, he can't be impeached for it. So the entire national security machinery is geared toward maintaining what Hitchens calls a cloud of unknowing around the true actions of the state.
Okay, so let's pause and look at the map we have drawn so far. We have a design based on hollowed-out euphemisms, client journalism, and secret black budgets. And we have an incentive structure that rewards we-thinking, artificial polling loops, and willful ignorance. What are the predictable structural outcomes of running a society on this exact software for decades?
The primary outcome is a total degradation of reality. Hitchens describes this using a very sharp phrase, the drift toward heroic cretinism.
Heroic cretinism. That sounds pretty insulting.
It's pure Hitchens. But he is using it analytically, not just as an insult. A cretin, in this specific systemic context, is someone who has lost the capacity to speak or think with precision. And the heroic part implies that they are doing it with a profound sense of civic duty. The political pundits and the press secretaries genuinely believe they are being deeply responsible by using this flattened, hollow language. But the outcome is a public debate that is totally unmoored from the structural reality of the world.
The Gulf War example in the source text really illustrates this perfectly. This was around 1990, 1991, the buildup to the war.
Right. You had President Bush and his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, managing the crisis. And the mainstream media coverage didn't focus on the physical reality of what a war would mean. Instead, they obsessively reported on the signals the administration was sending to Saddam Hussein.
Oh, I remember reading that section. It was all about, is the president sending a strong signal? Did Saddam miss the signal?
Yes. The wartime framing completely reshapes public consent. The coverage devolved into this bizarre semiotic analysis. It was like listening to commentators analyze a poker game. He's bluffing. He's raising the stakes. They weren't discussing the reality of the policy, the incoming shrapnel, the burning oil wells, the civilian death toll, the geopolitical instability. They were exclusively discussing the public relations performance of the political actors.
The public debate is entirely hollowed out. It becomes a review of the theater production rather than a debate about the reality of the violence.
Exactly. We stop asking the fundamental democratic question, is this war justified and necessary? And we start asking, is the president effectively conveying a message of resolve? Those are two completely different conversations. One is a substantive debate about state power. The other is just media criticism. The outcome is this endless hall of mirrors where the public only ever sees the reflections of power, but never the actual mechanisms.
And in that hall of mirrors, the actual historical record just disappears. Hitchens uses this incredible metaphor to explain the emergence of shadow history. It's from a Richard Condon novel called Winter Kills. He talks about the refuse heap.
This is absolutely central to understanding the systemic outcome. In that novel, a character explains that the real history of the state, the assassinations, the black budget payoffs, the covert intelligence operations, is simply too ugly to be shown in the front parlor. So it is piled up in a massive refuse heap, a garbage dump, completely out of public view.
And what does the public get instead?
They get faked artifacts, they get the official Blue Ribbon Commission report, they get the sanitized press release, they get the Warren Commission.
The Warren Commission is the ultimate archetype here. And it's important to note, Hitchens isn't necessarily arguing for one specific alternative theory about the JFK assassination. He is analyzing the structural intent of the commission itself.
Correct. He views the Warren Commission not as an investigative body, but as a pacification measure. He describes it as a group of establishment lawyers who fundamentally decided that the American people could not withstand the shock of history.
They truly believed the truth, whatever it actually was simply too dangerous for the public to handle.
Too destabilizing. If the structural reality involved the intelligence agencies or organized crime or foreign governments, it might shatter the consensus or lead to massive civil unrest. So the system decided to produce a soothing, faked artifact, a Stephen Foster melody. One lone nut. No systemic failure. Go back to sleep. The institutions are secure.
But this creates a profound psychological schizophrenia in the public, doesn't it? Because people aren't stupid. They can sense when they are being managed by a consensus system.
That is the ultimate tragedy of this outcome. You get a permanent schism in the culture. You have the official story, which nobody in their heart of hearts actually believes, but which everyone must pretend to accept to remain a serious person. And alongside it, you have a massive vacuum of trust.
And that vacuum always gets filled.
It gets filled with white noise, with absolute paranoia. Because the public intuitively knows that the official narrative is a faked artifact from the front parlor, they start inventing their own esoteric histories. They begin to assume that literally everything is a covert operation.
So this incredibly elaborate system, which was designed entirely to manufacture stability and consensus, actually ends up creating a population that is deeply cynical and wildly gullible at the exact same time.
Precisely. The degradation of language precision leads to this. They won't believe a thoroughly sourced report in a major newspaper, but they will instantly believe a completely baseless rumor because it sounds like the refuse heap. That is the outcome of maintaining a shadow history alongside an official narrative. We also see this in the total flattening of language around conflict.
Hitchens talks about the word terrorism right there.
Yes. He argues that terrorism has been degraded into a completely vacuous term. It ceases to be a descriptive word about a specific type of violence and just becomes a label used by the state to immediately end all argument. It's applied selectively to enemies of the consensus, while state-sponsored violence is wrapped up in euphemisms. The outcome is what he calls a surf idiom.
A serf idiom, like peasants speaking to a king.
Exactly. It's a vernacular of total deference. Reporters don't ask what is structurally happening. They ask, Mr. Secretary, are we any nearer to a dialogue in this peace process? It's just exchanging empty noises.
Okay, so we have a broken reality, a hollowed-out debate, a shadow history, a serf idiom. But despite all of these massive failures, this system doesn't collapse. It survives. It survived Iran-Contra. It survived the Cold War. Why does it persist?
It persists because it has evolved a highly effective immune system. And the primary antibody of that immune system is the strict stigmatization of dissent. Professional incentives heavily punish anyone who steps out of line.
Hitchens points specifically to the weaponization of the term conspiracy theorist,
He calls it an ailment of democracy.
which is an interesting framing. He argues that the slur itself is the ailment, not the people asking the question.
Right. Look at how the trap works structurally. When someone questions the official narrative, the establishment immediately demands a smoking gun.
They say, show me the signed document from the president ordering the crime.
Exactly. Show me the exact memo. But, as we just saw with the incentive for willful ignorance, the entire architecture of the state within the state is designed so that nothing illegal is ever written down. Robert Gates didn't want to know. The black budget has no receipts.
So there is never going to be a smoking gun. It's a fallacy.
It's a structural impossibility in most cases. So if an investigative journalist points out the glaring pattern, the money trail, the obvious systemic connections, the silent rhythms of the operation, but they lack a signed confession, they are accused of lacking absolute proof, and then the label is applied. They are dismissed as a paranoid conspiracy theorist.
And once you get hit with that label by the consensus,
You are professionally exiled. Your credentialing is revoked. You are no longer a serious person in Washington. You don't get invited to the Sunday morning panel shows. You lose your access to the lobby. And this profound fear of professional exile keeps the rest of the media entirely in line. The culture heavily rewards belonging over clarity. It is always safer to be wrong within the safety of the consensus than to be right outside of it.
there is also another mechanism of persistence here, which is the role of crises. Hitchens notes that when things get genuinely frightening, the system tightens its grip. Crisis moments compress critical faculties.
Yes, the national security framing completely suppresses scrutiny. The we fallacy kicks in hardest during a crisis. Hitchens uses the Rushdie affair as a prime example of this.
The fatwa against Salman Rushdie.
Right. A foreign theocracy issued a death sentence against a British novelist simply for writing a book of fiction. In theory, you would expect the democratic West to stand up in absolute unified outrage and say, this is an intolerable attack on fundamental freedom of speech.
But structurally, that is not what happened at all.
Not even close. There was a massive amount of institutional shuffling. President Bush and European leaders were deeply worried about their strategic interests. They were worried about trade deals, about hostages, about geopolitical stability in the Middle East. Hitchens catalogs all these sorry evasions from the establishment, statements like, well, the book is highly offensive, or we must respect other cultures and not provoke unrest.
They were actively balancing the core principle of free expression against the bureaucratic interests of the state.
And in that highly compressed crisis moment, anyone demanding a rigid defense of free speech was seen as rocking the boat. They were threatening the diplomatic consensus. In a crisis, the system always demands unity. Don't criticize the administration while troops are deployed. Don't endanger the delicate trade negotiations. The pressure to conform to the state's needs becomes totally overwhelming.
And finally, under persistence, there is just this sheer bureaucratic insulation of the intelligence agencies. They outlast the elected officials.
Hitchens quotes James Jesus Angleton here, a legendary, incredibly paranoid CIA counterintelligence chief. Angleton once stated that it was inconceivable that a secret intelligence arm of the government has to comply with all the overt orders of that government.
That is a terrifying quote. It explicitly states the esoteric state does not have to obey the exoteric state.
It is the ultimate persistence mechanism. Presidents come and go every 4 or 8 years. But the institutional architecture, the black budgets, the covert leverage, the incentive structures remains permanently in place, completely insulated from democratic elections.
So the system is insulated by fear of exile, by the compression of crises, and by permanent bureaucracy. It feels entirely impregnable. How do we possibly see through it? If the credentialed newspapers are producing client journalism and the official government reports are just faked artifacts, where do we go for actual structural truth? And this is where Hitchens takes a pivot that I think is just brilliant.
He points us away from the news desk and towards the bookshelf. Interconnection, literature as diagnostic equipment.
He makes this incredible argument that in a world structured by systemic concealment, fiction is often the only place where you can actually document the truth.
It sounds like a paradox, but analytically it is deeply profound. Standard factual reporting fundamentally fails to capture this system because standard reporting is forced to rely on the system's own language and the system's own credentialed sources.
Right, if you ask a politician a question using langue de bois, you're going to get an answer in langue de bois. You are permanently trapped on the surface layer of the consensus.
But the novelist is not constrained by the lobby. The novelist can create a structural hypothesis. Hitchens points specifically to Don DeLillo and his novel Libra, which is about Lee Harvey Oswald.
So it's a fictionalized account of the JFK assassination.
It is fiction, yes, but Hitchens argues that DeLillo's novel captures the absolute structural reality of the intelligence world far better than the thousands of pages of the Warren Commission ever did.
How does fiction achieve that?
Because the novelist understands the psychology of the system. DeLillo understands what it takes to actually operate inside a state of permanent secrecy. He understands the compartmentalization of the heart.
Compartmentalization of the heart, that is a beautiful phrase. What does it mean in this context?
Think about what is psychologically required to be a career spy or a double agent. Hitchens brings up the famous British trader Kim Philby to illustrate this. To do that job, to live that life, you have to completely split your own personality. You have to genuinely be Kim, the loyal, charming British friend at dinner, and simultaneously be Kim, the ruthless Soviet agent. You have to hold two entirely contradictory realities in your mind all time.
It requires a massive, sustained cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. Journalism generally treats people as rational actors operating on a surface level. He did X to achieve Y, but fiction understands that human beings operating in deep secrecy are irrational, emotional, and paranoid. Fiction can explore the aggressive self-pity of the intelligence officer who truly believes he is saving democracy by covertly destroying it.
Hitchens points out that the name Kim is a direct connection to Rudyard Kipling's famous novel, Kim.
Right, the boy spy with two separate sides to his head. Fiction has the unique ability to map that internal esoteric terrain. It can show us the refuse heap because the novelist doesn't require a smoking gun document to prove a specific crime. The novelist just needs to accurately reproduce the atmosphere of power and paranoia.
There is also a really vital linguistic point he makes here, which ties everything back to the beginning. He calls it the Orwellian standard.
George Orwell is essentially Hitchens' patron saint. And the Orwellian standard isn't just a vague warning about Big Brother. It is a very specific, active duty to weigh words as if they meant what they said.
Restoring the actual weight and gravity to the language.
Yes. If the primary political design of the consensus system is to empty words of their meaning, to make the word philosophical mean I don't care, or to make the word healing mean a shut up, then the mission of literature is to forcefully fill those words back up with their true meaning, to insist that a state execution is killing, to insist that a semi-detached minister is the victim of a coordinated political purge.
So literature acts as the antidote to the crisis. It serves as the diagnostic lens that corrects our blurred vision.
It allows us to hear the silent rhythms and the unheard dissonances that the mainstream news cycle completely ignores. Hitchens points out that the root of the word conspire literally means to breathe together. A great novelist can check the respiration of the state in a way a White House correspondent simply cannot.
So we have covered a massive amount of ground today. We have mapped the design of the system, the euphemisms, the compliant lobby, the unconstitutional black budgets.
Right.
We have analyzed the incentives, the psychological we fallacy, the polling feedback loops, the promotion of willful ignorance.
Yes.
We have traced the outcomes, the heroic cretinism of public debate, the emergence of shadow history.
Yeah.
And we've seen how it persists through the weaponization of terms like conspiracy theorist and the suppression of dissent during crises.
All building up to how we can use literature to see through it.
Exactly. So taking all of this structural mapping into account, I want to ask the central question of our show. What is the crisis in perception here?
It is a profound crisis, and it operates simultaneously on three distinct levels. First, it is a crisis of misperception. We have been systematically trained by this architecture to mistake consensus, meaning polite language and bipartisanship, for actual democratic legitimacy. We mistake manufactured polling numbers for the organic will of the public. We mistake the sanitized official report for actual history. We are constantly looking at the mask and believing it is the face.
We mistake the map for the territory.
Exactly. Second, it is a crisis of obscured structure. This is the complete invisibility of the incentive architecture. We perceive the politician giving the speech on television, but we fail to see the pollster's forced choice data that dictated the speech. We miss the press handler who authorized the leak. We are entirely blinded to the black budget that actually funds the geopolitical reality. We see the puppet, but the structural incentives pulling the strings remain totally obscured.
And the third level.
Finally, it is a fundamental failure of interpretation. Because the system obscures the structure so well, we default to analyzing the surface. We focus endlessly on personalities. Is the president likable? Is this candidate electable? We look for a smoking gun document to prove individual corruption, and when the system ensures we don't find one, we just give up and accept the faked artifact.
We look for individual villains instead of analyzing systemic designs.
Yes. The ultimate crisis is that we have been conditioned not to perceive the very power structures that govern our reality. But, as Hitchens shows, systems-level analysis restores that visibility. By actively rejecting the we fallacy, we stop psychologically annexing ourselves to the state. By applying the tools of literary diagnosis, skepticism, irony, listening for the silent rhythms, we can finally perceive the state within the state. We realize that the mystery of how power operates isn't some magical fog. It is simply the institutional refusal of the establishment to face the shock of history.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.